Okay, I think we're live on Facebook now, so we're going to start the presentation. Welcome everybody. I know most everybody here, but just wanted to tell for the viewing audience on Facebook a little bit about myself and tell you a little bit about some of my biases and some disclosures and stuff. But I'm Jonathan Baird. I'm a certified financial planner. I'm CFO at People's Bank. I'm a financial advisor at Mustard Seed Wealth Management here in town. And I'm also a certified Bitcoin professional. And so it's kind of a passion of mine, what Bitcoin means to me. And we'll talk more about why that is here in a little bit. But before we get started on that, just some disclosures for everybody. I do own Bitcoin. Shouldn't be too surprising at this point. It's a significant part of my portfolio. It started out as a smaller part, and it has become a more significant part of my portfolio. I have political, philosophical, moral, and fiscal biases toward Bitcoin because of its monetary policy, which we will talk about shortly. I don't recommend to anyone in particular that they invest much, if any, so this is not me trying to sell you on Bitcoin specifically. If you want to buy Bitcoin, of course, you're welcome to, but there are a lot of risks that you need to consider. You need to consider, how much capacity you have to take risk, how you feel about taking risk. So it's not financial advice. Consider your personal situation. Don't invest anything in assets like this that you can't afford to lose. If you don't believe in it, don't trust it, don't buy it. So not financial advice. Did I mention this is not financial advice? Nope, not financial advice. So when thinking about Bitcoin, we need to take a step back and think about a bigger question. And that question is, what is money? And so think about that. In America, it's pretty easy for us to not think much about money because our money works pretty well, but it hasn't always been that way. And so as we roll back the clock and think historically about what money is and how it has evolved over time, what we see throughout history is that money is an emergent property of a complex economy. Okay, and so think about the earliest days of trade. It was a barter system. So we had just a barter system. And barter is just trading one item or one good for another good or another service. And so in a very simple economy, which these don't exist really anywhere, but in a really simple economy, if the three goods you had were chickens, eggs, and bread, you would have to have trading pairs to try to be able to figure out what each of those items was worth. But they would all be priced in relation to one another. So how many eggs would it take to get a loaf of bread? Maybe a dozen eggs gets you a loaf of bread. Maybe a chicken gets you 10 loaves of bread. Maybe a dozen eggs and a loaf of bread gets you a chicken. There's all kinds of figuring that you have to do to try to figure out what the value of each of these things are in relation to one another. So the solution that we came up with was to create money. And money is just simply put a medium of exchange. And the best monies throughout history have been the most tradable good. So it's something that people can use or something that people can hold, that everybody recognizes as having value, and it solves the barter problem. Okay, and the barter problem, again, is just the problem with having a complex economy with lots of goods and services to trade and trying to figure out what the value of those things are in relation to the other goods and services. So instead of having that really convoluted and confusing system, you want to have a medium of exchange or money. So money solves the barter problem. That's what it does. So it's a technology that is used by human beings to solve the barter problem, and it arises in all complex economies. So throughout history, people have used seashells for money. People have used gold for money. People have used crystals for money. They've used tobacco leaves for money. They've used all kinds of different things for money. And each of these things have certain qualities about themselves that make them good money. And so some things work good as money. Some things don't work very good as money. So what makes good money? So that's the question. So we're still thinking about what money is. Okay, so it arose in society as economies became more complex. As economies became more complex, people were searching for something they could use to to solve the barter problem, and what things or what characteristics of money made good money. So the first characteristic that we'll talk about is portability. Portability just means it's is what it sounds like. It's just your ability to move it from one place to another. And so, you know, if big rocks are money, is that very portable? If it's big, huge rocks? There were actually, no, it's not. There were actually tribes that used big rocks called the rice stones back in, you know, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. And it didn't really work very well because that money was not very portable. So you want your money to be able to be carried from one place to another or sent from one place to another relatively easily. You want your money to be divisible. Divisible money is important because you need to be able to do different size transactions with it. You need to be able to buy a cup of coffee. You need to be able to buy a car or a house. You need to be able to spend something, you know, buy a skyscraper, but you also need to be able to buy toilet paper. You know, you just need to have your money in increments that will facilitate trade at every level, small to large. So your money needs to be divisible. Your money needs to be fungible, which means that one unit of the currency equals any other unit of the currency. And so $1 should be the same here as it is across town. It's better, you know, the more people that recognize the value and the larger the network is, and the more people recognize the value of that unit of currency, it needs to be uniform across the network of people that use it. And so in America, we have the dollar. Pretty much wherever you go, everybody kind of has an agreement on what a dollar is worth. Now, it's going to be different in different places because in New York City, things cost more than they do in Magnolia, Arkansas. But there needs to be fungibility so that we can have kind of a common standard by which we judge the different types or the different units of a currency. It needs to be recognizable. This is important because if it's not recognizable, then it's easily counterfeited. Like, so if you have fake dollars or fake gold, for instance, then that's a problem. It needs to be recognizable. You need to be able to ascertain whether or not this currency, this money is actually real and not counterfeit. And then finally, and there are more qualities of money that make good money, but these are the top 5, is scarcity. Scarcity is important because if there's no limit on the amount of units of currency that you have in a given system, that causes all kinds of problems that we'll talk about later. It causes inflation. It causes you to not be able to understand or ascertain the value relative to other goods and services because there's an ever-changing number of units of currency out there. And if it's constantly going up and up and up, which we're used to, then that's in itself a problem. So these are the characteristics of money, and throughout history, these are the things that have made good money. And so as we have kind of through trial and error figured out what good money is and what bad money is, these are the characteristics that tend to win. I'm going to turn the air on. Is anybody else hot? I had turned it down earlier, but it didn't stay on. Okay. So these are the characteristics of money: portability, divisibility, fungibility, recognizability, and scarcity. So throughout history, money developed. People use gold, people use crystals, people use seashells. But we kind of, throughout history and up until a few hundred years ago, people kind of centered on gold as being the best type of money, the gold standard. I mean, that's something that our country was founded on. We had a gold standard. And so we had what would be known as hard money or sound money, good money. But it eventually devolved into a fiat system. And fiat just simply means by command, which means that some centralized authority or issuer can issue as many units of the currency as they want to. And there are a lot of reasons why that happened. Gold was not very portable. I mean, it's kind of portable. It was okay for a simple economy, but as the economy became more complex, as it became worldwide, as we became spread out all over the world, it became harder and harder to move that money, those dollars around, that gold around. And so what we did was, and banks came from gold. People were carrying their gold around, but they kind of started realizing that people would knock you in the head and take your gold. And so people would deposit their gold at these banks, and they would issue paper notes that would be redeemable for gold. But then banks, as sometimes is their MO, become greedy, and they thought, well, people never come and get their gold. I can issue more fiat or more paper certificates to represent that I have more gold than I actually have, and they were able to do that to scam people. And it works until it doesn't, until people come in and you have a run on the bank, and y'all have heard of that. If anybody's seen It's a Wonderful Life, there was a run on the bank there, and that would happen with some of these gold holding institutions. They would come to redeem the gold, redeem their certificates for gold, and they would find out that they didn't actually have the gold there. And so we devolved into a fiat system eventually, because that kind of got out of whack. There was the Gold Confiscation Act in 1933. There was the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 that kind of reworked our entire monetary system to where we got further and further away from a gold standard to now today where there is no gold standard. We do have gold. The United States has gold at Fort Knox, but who knows how much they have, and there certainly isn't any kind of correlation between units of currency and amount of gold. There's nothing tying the amount of dollars that can be issued to the amount of gold that we have. So there's no backing by the dollar. And you can see the value of the dollar, the purchasing power of the dollar over time here. And you can see how some of these different things affected the value of money. And so we have lost pretty much since 1900. This only goes to 2000, but since 1900, which was a little bit before the establishment of the Federal Reserve and some of these other things that I've mentioned, the dollar has lost about 98% of its value over that time period. And so when you have a fiat currency and you have a centralized group of people who can issue this currency, it's not surprising that they issue a lot of it. What if you had a money printer in your basement? What would you do? Or in your closet? We don't have basements down here. But if you had a money printer in your closet, would you use it? Well, of course you would. Now, I'm saying you could make real dollars that couldn't be distinguished from others, so there's no chance of you going to jail for counterfeiting. Not recommending it, just asking the question. And be honest with yourself. If you had a money printer that could print real $100 bills, would you use it? Well, everybody would. And politicians are no different, and I would argue that maybe even they're more likely to use it than we are. And they actually have it, and it's called the Federal Reserve. Now, there's some, there's some checks and balances there, but not enough. And so what happens, though, is they print a bunch of money. They point those new, freshly printed dollars at the things they like, and we have a huge amount of money that floods into the system, and then we have inflation, which is the predictable outcome. One thing when we think about inflation, a lot of people like to measure inflation from zero. So if our economy is made up of Diet Coke, and that's the only good that we have, and last year this Coke cost $1, and this year the Coke costs $1.05, what would we say the inflation rate is? 5%, right? Okay. Now, is that fair to say it's 5%? Well, yeah, in a way it is fair, but what happens to, what about this TV right here? Or that projector that's using to project this? 5 years ago, we bought this TV for $600 or $700. How much can I buy this TV for today? $250. Yeah. And I mean, if I try to sell it, I probably couldn't even get that, because technology is deflationary, and that works really. You can see it really well in things like TVs and other electronics and technology, but it also works with other goods. We get better at extruding aluminum. We get better at getting the ingredients that make Coke Zero taste so delicious. And it should be, if we had sound money, that over time, everything should go down in value. And so it's not really fair to measure the inflation rate only from zero, because if we had sound money, the price of things would actually be decreasing every year. So when we talk about the inflation rate, and governments like to do this because it hides some of their shenanigans that they do. They like to look at it from zero, but really they should be looking at it from below zero. In other words, the amount of money or the amount of value or cost that our goods and services would go down if we had sound money. And gentlemen can disagree about what that number is, but I would contend that it's at least 5%, if not closer to 7 or 10%. So in other words, if we had sound money, our prices should be falling, and they should be falling at a rate of 5 to 10% every year. So not only do we not keep it at zero, we actually increase the cost of goods and services by 2 to 3%, and I think those numbers are even fishy. But it's not really accurate, in other words, to say that the inflation rate is only 3%. It's probably, in reality, if we had sound money, closer to 10. But anyway, that's a little bit about inflation and why it's important to think about these things and to think about why sound money might solve a lot of our problems. I do want to mention, too, our money works pretty well. You know, the U.S. dollar works pretty well. If you want to send money to somebody, I can send through PayPal, Venmo, Apple Pay, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover Card, Cash App, you know, name it. I've got all the apps, you know, to be able to send money around the world, wherever I want to. But it's not the same for everybody. You know, we're 330 million people, and we've got a pretty good monetary system that works okay, though there's certainly room to criticize it. But it's not so for the vast majority of the world. The vast majority of the world does not have anything close to what our monetary system is. As weak as ours is, everybody else's is way weaker, almost without exception. There are a few maybe that are a little better, but 5 billion people have a far inferior experience with money than we do. Which is why I think Bitcoin is so important, because it doesn't just solve America's problems, as relatively small as they are compared to other countries. It can solve other countries' problems as well. And so don't just think about it from a U.S.-centric perspective. Think about it from a worldwide perspective and what this new technology can do for people in the third world. And in not third world countries, but other countries that have massive inflation rates. So this is the money supply, just to illustrate our money supply. So in 1960, and this is M2, which is basically the amount of money that's circulating out there in the system. It's one measure of it. I don't want to get too technical on it. But back in 1960, I'm not sure what that number is. It's so close to zero, it's hard to tell. But maybe it's 100 billion or something like that. Well, in 1980, it had increased to maybe about $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion. And then in the next 20 years, it went from $1.5 trillion to about $5.5 or $6 trillion is what that number is. But look what happened after COVID. I mean, we just kind of have a hockey stick up here in the amount of money in circulation, dollars in circulation. And so we increased the money supply during COVID, which this started, it was about right here is where it started. So it was a little under 16 trillion. And now we have, and this is an old chart, now we have in excess of 22 trillion in M2 money supply. So we added to the dollars in circulation a little over $6 trillion in new dollars that were created. If there were only 16 trillion before and you add 6 trillion to it, that's about a 40%-ish increase in the supply of money, which is why we've seen so much inflation that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. And so it's bipartisan. Both parties did it. Not necessarily a political issue, other than the fact that they were all politicians who did it, and they were okay with it. But that's what happened, and that's why we have seen such a huge increase in the price of goods and services, because there's more dollars in circulation chasing the same or similar number of goods and services. So that's a little bit about inflation. So we've gone through the history of money. We've gone through the history of gold, very abbreviated. This is, I could talk about this for hours and hours, but we don't have that kind of time. So we're going to get to the point real quick. What is Bitcoin? So here's what Bitcoin is. This is the first block of the Bitcoin network that was mined. And it was mined by Satoshi Nakamoto, who's the creator of Bitcoin. And this was the inscription that was in this first block on the Bitcoin blockchain. Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. So this is January 3rd. The Times article's from January 3rd. I think the first block was mined on January 4th of 2009. And if you go back in your mind what was going on then, we had the housing crash, we had bank failures all over the place, and we had bailouts. We had the TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program, that was a $750 billion program, which doesn't seem like just a crazy amount of money today because now they do $3 and $4 trillion. I don't know if there's $3 or $4 trillion bills, but we've had a couple of $2 trillion plus bills that have been passed. But that's where Bitcoin was born. It was born during the bailouts of the great financial crisis, or the Great Recession, as it's called sometimes. And so Satoshi Nakamoto came up with the technology to be able to create a currency that could be used in a peer-to-peer fashion as a medium of exchange, as cash or currency or money. And he did it using blockchain technology. Now, we don't have to get too in detail about that, but we'll talk about some of the impacts this has, what it enables, what type of money this new technology enables to exist, which hasn't ever been able to exist before. The closest corollary we have is gold, because gold can't be printed. You can't just muster gold out of nothing. You can't create it out of nothing, unless you're God, and none of us are God. And so, but Bitcoin itself is perfectly knowably scarce. You can know exactly how many Bitcoin are in circulation today. You can know exactly how many Bitcoin will be in circulation tomorrow, and in 50 years, and in 100 years, and in 1,000 years. We know exactly how many there will be, and it is programmatically coded to enforce that cap of 21 million, which we'll talk about here in just a second. So here are some of the characteristics of Bitcoin, and kind of to contrast that with and to explain why it ticks all the boxes to be good money. And so portability. Bitcoin can be sent anywhere in the world almost immediately for a very small amount of money. In fact, the other day I looked, there was a transaction, somebody sent about $2 billion worth of Bitcoin across the world. We don't know exactly where they sent it, but they sent it a transaction. It was a $2 billion transaction, and it cost them like $1.23. Sometimes it's $5, sometimes it's $10. There's actually a market that is used to price Bitcoin transactions. But if you could make a $2 billion transaction for $5, that's really efficient and really cheap, okay? And it's still that way for now. It may not always be that way. It may be the case that in the future, all of the transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain network will be much larger, and the cost to do it will be much higher. I doubt it will ever get crazy where it's more than maybe 1% of the value. In fact, I'd be very surprised if it got to that point. What would happen is the market would be incented to make much bigger transactions and make them less frequently. So it's digital. You can send it just as easily as you can send an email. You don't even have to have a connection to the internet. There has to be a connection somewhere to the internet so that the network can receive the information of the transaction, which there's certain pieces of information that you would have if you wanted to send money or Bitcoin over the Bitcoin network. You'd have to have your private keys to your account in a wallet, and you'd have to have a receiving address where you're sending it to. And as long as you have a balance in your account, in your wallet, and your private key or your password to your account, and you can sign the transaction and broadcast it to the network, that transaction will go through. And so Bitcoin is completely portable. It can be sent anywhere in the world as long as there's an internet connection or close to an internet connection where somebody can send or receive a transaction. It needs to be divisible. Again, money needs to be divisible. How divisible is Bitcoin? You can break one Bitcoin into 100 million different pieces. Those different pieces are called Satoshis. That's the smallest unit of Bitcoin that's currently available. If we needed to divide it further, we could. So it's perfectly divisible. Right now, 1,000 Satoshis is like $1 or something. I can't remember exactly what it is. Somebody can correct me on that. But it's about $1 for maybe 1,800 Satoshis is $1. And so, think about it from a dollar standpoint. If Bitcoin ever reached the price of $1 million, that would mean one Satoshi, or the smallest unit of Bitcoin, would be worth 1 cent. And so, we got a long way to go until it gets to that price. If it ever gets to that price, who knows? Not saying it will, not saying it won't, don't know. But it's got very good divisibility, perfect divisibility. And again, if we needed to be able to divide it further than that, we could. You can add, a 0 to that number if we needed to. The code of the network could be changed to make it more divisible if necessary. Fungibility, 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin. Bitcoins are all, one Bitcoin in your wallet is worth one Bitcoin in somebody else's wallet. They're all worth the same amount. Now, they're going to be priced differently in different places, in different currencies, but, they pretty much all cluster around certain trade prices. And right now, the price is around $59,000, something like that. And you would get a correlative price in a different country, in a different currency, that would equal $59,000 in the U.S. Now, there are certain exceptions to that. Sometimes there's in South Korea, there's what they call it the kimchi premium. It traded at above the U.S. dollar price in South Korea for a while, just because it was difficult for them to get a hold of Bitcoin there. But by and large, it's pretty universally recognized as one of the most liquid markets in the world. It trades 24/7. Anybody can get it anytime they want to. There are exchanges that trade it constantly, 24/7, 365. And the network has never gone down since in like the last 12 years. It went down for a little bit in the early days when they were still trying to figure things out, but it's been running without any hiccups for at least 10 years, I believe. It's recognizable. It's very verifiable. There's no app on your phone that you can use to test whether the gold that somebody gives you is real or not. There's not a gold testing app now. You might look up on your phone how to tell if it's real, but if you have a phone and you have a trusted wallet, then you can verify a transaction. You can look at the Bitcoin that comes in that wallet and know for sure that the Bitcoin is real. It's not fake Bitcoin, and that's one of the things, kind of to backtrack a little bit, that makes Bitcoin so unique. Because it is natively digital, sometimes it's hard it was impossible for us to think about the ability to have scarce digital assets. But the invention of Bitcoin with that technology made it possible for us to have scarce digital assets. So, and that leads us into the idea of scarcity. Now with Bitcoin, you can have perfect digital scarcity. You know exactly how many Bitcoin are out there. You know that when a transaction happens on the Bitcoin network, that if somebody sends you one Bitcoin, it'd be a really rich person that would do that, just to send you one, but that person no longer has the Bitcoin, and that you definitely have that same Bitcoin, and that person didn't send that same Bitcoin to anybody else. If I take a digital picture of you, and I email it to my kids, and I email it to my uncle, and I email it to my friends, before long, if that picture propagates and people send it to other people, it can be replicated over and over and over again. And so it's really kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around the fact that there could be something that is digitally scarce. But that's basically what Bitcoin solved. It created digital scarcity. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but it's a decentralized ledger. There are ledgers all over the world. And as transactions happen, every 10 minutes, a new block or a new list of transactions is added to the state of the network, and all of those different nodes on the network or servers on the network update the ledger. And at the end of that 10-minute period, a new block is mined. All the transactions are final. They're put into the blockchain, and they're spread out over these thousands and thousands of computers. And then that's why we can be sure that the transactions are final, which we'll talk about here in just a second. So it is immutable. So that means that Bitcoin is immutable. You can't change it. You can't go back in time and change the state of the network. You can't change the balance in somebody's account. Today, if PayPal wants to shut you out of your PayPal account, they can do it. Or if the government wants to go to PayPal and say, Eric can't use his PayPal account anymore, then they can shut you down. They can shut you out of the PayPal system. And so and they can reverse transactions. If they don't like what you spent your money on, or they don't like the money that you got from somebody for doing a service for somebody else, they can reverse that transaction and give it back to them. That's not possible with Bitcoin. Once the transaction happens, it's done. There's no take-backs, no do-overs. Once the transaction happens, it's done. It's final, which is good and bad in some cases. Mostly good because it makes it predictable. But, if you accidentally send somebody, you're supposed to send somebody 0.01 Bitcoin and you send them 1 Bitcoin, unless they're, if you trust the person, they'll probably send it back to you, but if it's a questionable person, they probably won't. And so, you have to be careful who you send it to, but it causes you to take full responsibility for your actions on the network and in the transactions that you do, because the network is immutable. So when you get into Bitcoin and understand how it works, and you're doing transactions on the Bitcoin network, it's very nerve-wracking, because you're making this transaction, and if you get something wrong, it could be very costly. It's getting much easier to use, but it is immutable, and that comes from the decentralized nature of the network. It's all these computers all over the world that are agreeing on how much everybody has in their account, and all the ledgers update. And if somebody comes in and tries to enter the Bitcoin network with a new node that has a different history, with a different balance in just one person's account or one wallet's account, the network will recognize that new node that's trying to introduce bad information into the network and kick it out. And so they won't be able to affect the network at all. And so it's immutable. It's borderless. There's no Bitcoin CEO. There's no Bitcoin headquarters. There's nowhere you can go. The government can't go find the Bitcoin CEO and say, hey, I don't like this person, debank them. That can't happen. There's no country that controls it. China can't control. China tried to control it, and they couldn't. So it's arguably one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world, and they were not able to, ban Bitcoin or shut down Bitcoin. If they can't do it, it's unlikely the United States could do it. It's unlikely that any other country in the world can do it. And I would argue that even if they tried, they would still fail. And we can talk more about that later if y'all want to. But it's borderless. It's non-sovereign. There's no central authority that issues new Bitcoin that can be manipulated or that can use it for their own ends. It's permissionless. There's no barriers to entry. You don't have to agree to a certain set of beliefs or ideals or be a certain way. Anybody that has access to the internet and has a device that they can send transactions on can use the Bitcoin network. It's permissionless. There's no middlemen that can prevent you from transacting. It's unconfiscatable. So now, most people own Bitcoin on an exchange, like through a custodian, like Coinbase or PayPal or Venmo. There's all kinds of different custodians out there that own Bitcoin for you. And if that's the case, you don't really own your Bitcoin. It's like a bank. Like if you deposit your dollars at the bank, the bank is holding it for you, and they will probably give it to you. Of course, they don't want to steal it from you, but you ultimately don't have self-sovereign ownership of it. It's kind of like if you hold gold, like if you own gold and hold it in physical form, that's closer to self-sovereign ownership, but it still has physicality, and it can be confiscated. Bitcoin actually can be held in your brain. So you can actually own Bitcoin in your brain, right? You can't do that with gold. So picture this, a refugee from Ukraine who maybe they tried to conscript him into the army to fight Russia. He was opposed to it. He sells all his goods in the world that he owned. He buys Bitcoin. He can memorize a 12-word phrase, put it in his brain, and if he escapes the country, if he flees to the U.S. or some other country that would take him, he could set up a new life with his Bitcoin that he stored in his head on the way out of town, out of the country. And so it's unconfiscatable. It can be unconfiscatable. If you got it on Coinbase and the government doesn't like you, or somebody else doesn't like you, maybe they can, or if they can scam you, they could steal it from you from Coinbase. But if you self-sovereignly own it in cold storage, you can actually have true ownership of that asset, Bitcoin. So it's unconfiscatable. It has a terminal inflation rate of 0, which means that currently there's 19 million and change Bitcoin in circulation. There will only ever be 21 million, so there's only about 6% of the supply left to be issued into circulation. But we know that there will never be more than 21 million. And so you can look at it as though it's perfectly scarce, because it is. We know exactly when those coins will be issued, And currently there's 450 Bitcoin released every day, and the Bitcoin that's released every day is a reward for the people that run the network, and it kind of helps it self-propagate. So there's nobody's paying people to run the Bitcoin network. They're all competing in a game to win the Bitcoin block reward, which every 10 minutes gets paid, and it's 3.125 Bitcoin. So there's all these miners out there, and y'all have heard of Bitcoin mining. Who's heard of Bitcoin mining? Yeah, Bitcoin mining. So there's all these computers that are working on the network. They're defending the network, they're supporting the network, they're adding transactions to the network, they're doing all kinds of work for the network, and in reward, as a reward for that, they get the block reward that happens every 10 minutes, and it's kind of like a lottery, and the heaviest users or the heaviest producers of energy that are used to run the network are most likely to get the block reward every 10 minutes. So it's kind of like a lottery every 10 minutes, and somebody wins 3.125 Bitcoin. Now, that's not always economical, because if you had all these individual people working to get that reward, you wouldn't have a very good chance of doing it. So what happens a lot of times is people will pool their resources together, and they will create these mining pools, and then that mining pool will share the rewards that pool gets every 10 minutes with the people that own the hardware that's used in the pool. And but it has a terminal inflation rate of 0. I got off track there a little bit. That's okay. But we know that there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, and that won't happen until the year 2140. Okay, so that's Bitcoin. So Bitcoin actually proposes and makes possible a new, previously impossible monetary policy. So it has a new monetary policy, and you can contrast this with the current monetary policy of the United States and all fiat regimes around the world. So the halving. So how do we know that there are only going to be 21 million Bitcoin? Well, it's programmatic. In the beginning, when Bitcoin was created, and you go back to that first block that was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, does anybody remember what the block reward was back then? Anybody remember? Okay, in 2009, when it first came out, the first block reward was 50 Bitcoin. Okay, and Satoshi was running it on a laptop, probably, or a small computer. New people added to the network, and they were competing for that block reward. And so first there was one node, Satoshi's node, then there was another one. It was Hal Finney, actually, is who the second one was. Other ones, I can't remember some of the names of the early Bitcoiners, but they're out there easily identifiable, some of them not so much. But every 10 minutes, 50 Bitcoin would be released into the network. Early on, again, it was just a few people, but as the value grew, as the network grew, it became harder and harder to win that block reward, and eventually now it's very difficult to win that, and it's only 3.125 Bitcoin, but 3.125 Bitcoin is way more valuable than 50 Bitcoin were back when it first started. But back to the point of why we know there will only ever be 21 million is because every 10 minutes 50 Bitcoin were released, and that happened for about 4 years. And during that first 4-year period, half of the Bitcoin supply was issued. So there were about 10,500,000 Bitcoin that were released in the first 4 years of the Bitcoin network. In the next 4 years, that reward got cut in half. So instead of it being 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes, it was 25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. And in the next 4 years, in the second epoch of Bitcoin's existence, half of the remaining supply was produced. And so it was 5,250,000 Bitcoin were created in the next 4 years. And the reward dropped to 25. And then it dropped to 12.5. And then it dropped to 6.25. And now it's at 3.125 Bitcoin that will happen. And then in about 3.5 years, a little more than that, it will drop in half again, and it will be 1.5625 Bitcoin that is released every 10 minutes. And so that will happen over time, every 4 years. The amount of Bitcoin that's created every day will drop in half, eventually till there's no more Bitcoin left, and it will eventually end at 0. There will be 0 block reward, because all the Bitcoin will have been released. There'll be 21 million, and that's all there will ever be. Okay. And so contrast that with dollar debasement. How many dollars are in circulation today? Depending on how you measure it, 24 trillion. How many dollars will be in circulation next year? I mean, we don't know exactly, but it's probably going to be more. It's probably going to be like, maybe it'll be 25 trillion. We know that there's going to be a deficit this year of about $3 trillion. And so new money will have to be created in order to fund that spending that the government's doing. But think about it in terms of dollar debasement. You know, we don't know how many dollars are going to be in circulation next year. We don't know how many dollars are in circulation right now. Exactly. We have a guesstimate, but we don't know exactly. We don't know how many. We sure don't know how many will be in circulation in 10 years, and we have absolutely no idea how many there will be in 100 years. So Bitcoin gives you certainty because you know exactly how many there are, how many there will be at any point in time. So let's contrast again with the dollar. The dollar is really good at transacting or transmitting value through space, right? If I want to send you $5 for getting me a Coke at Sonic on happy hour, which hopefully will be less than that, maybe $2, $3. If I want to send, I can PayPal you, and it's not a problem at all. So it's very easy to transmit value in dollars through space, but it's not good at transmitting value through time. If I offered you to give you $100 today, or to give you $100 in a year from now, which would you take? Every time. Today, right? Because $100 today is, we know, worth more than $100 tomorrow, right? So our dollars, the US dollar, is good at transmitting value through space, but it's not good at transmitting value through time. Let's think about gold for a second. Gold is pretty good at transmitting value through time because it's relatively scarce. It only increases the supply by about 2% per year, and historically it has held its value pretty well. One example that's given oftentimes is that you can buy a fine man's suit for 1 ounce of gold. Now, it'd be a really nice suit. I've never had a suit that nice, but throughout history, the idea of what a really nice suit or a upscale dress for a guy would be, it could be a toga back in ancient Greece, but a really nice one was about 1 ounce of gold. And today, you get an Armani suit or whatever, I don't even know what the names of them are, but you could get it's about $2,500. That would be a really nice suit today. So it has held its value pretty well, certainly relative to fiat currencies, through time. But the problem with gold is, especially in a worldwide economy, in a global economy, in a digital economy, it's not very good at transmitting value through space. So it's not very practical to use gold to transact with. So dollar's good at transmitting value through space but not time. Gold is good at transmitting value through time but not space. Bitcoin, it was engineered and created to optimize the transfer of value through space and time because it's portable, but it also has perfectly known scarcity. And so it has aspects of fiat money in that it's easy to transact. It also has characteristics of gold because it's designed at least to hold its value over time. Now, I know some of the questions you might have about that, but I'm just saying it's designed to do that. It's not that it's necessarily living up to those things today, but I think it has the ability to do that. That's the main part of the presentation about what it is. I'm going to talk about a few more things, but before I do, I just want to see if anybody has any questions or comments so far. I probably should have